Thank you for checking out my channel, Magnus Division here. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. This is Ukraine Escalation 2024, updated for current events. And so, in some of the past videos, especially earlier into the conflict, there was a lot of talk about Russia actually escalating the conflict using tactical nuclear weapons in order to bring a resolve to the conflict, with the kind of gamble that the United States and other Western powers would not want to continue that kind of escalation. The situation has changed quite a bit in the past couple of years. One thing Russia has shown is that it's able to replenish its stock, and it's becoming more of an attritional war, which Ukraine is probably not going to be able to overcome, not unless there was a radical change in the supply situation coming from the West. And so now we're going to look at this a little bit differently. Now we're going to look at Nato countries, Western countries, actually providing ground forces to escalate the confrontation. So Ukraine is kind of getting pushed, and so NATO has decided to utilize some of their ground forces, mainly in a support role, not in an actual combat role, but Russia has deemed this as an escalation. It's unacceptable. It's a red line. So now they're going to detonate at a very high level a low-yield weapon. They're going to do it over Kyiv. So we're looking at a 10-kiloton warhead at a 5,000-meter height. This will not produce casualties. It could produce some EMP, so we could have a loss of electronics, but this won't produce actual casualties. It's more of a message to mainly the Western powers. So you see no casualties recorded, and that's their way of 3 low-yield, high-detonation warheads being effort to escalate the situation, to de-escalate it. And so in this scenario, the United States is going to respond with a conventional strike at military bases near Belgorod. I'm probably butchering it. So one thing about the nuclear war simulator, it has something they list as conventional, but it doesn't really do a conventional strike because it's still going to model fallout and things like a nuclear strike would. So outside of messing with that, I just deleted the bases basically to represent that strike. Yes, there'd be some loss of personnel more likely, because this would have to be a heavy strike. If it's using conventional weapons, it's going to take quite a bit of warheads on target to really produce that result versus a nuclear strike. But remember, this is really going to be the first time a Western power is directly striking against Russia, which again would be another rung in that escalation ladder. And this is taking place in September this year. This is this hypothetical situation. And so after we've kind of escalated where there's Western troops in Ukraine, in a supply situation, Russia then escalates from there to detonating the nuclear warheads in high altitude over Kyiv. U.S. strikes, conventional strikes against a Russian military base across their border. So now Russia is going to go and climb that escalation ladder again. This is going to involve 2 lower yield, so the same kind of weapon, that SS Charlie, Sierra Charlie 8. And it can be anywhere between a 10 to 100 kiloton warhead. So we're going to still go on the lower end of it, because again, they're looking to escalate, but not escalate too much. So this is going to be detonated 200 meters above ground, so will produce casualties. They're going to target 3 Ukrainian air bases. They're going to do double strikes, so 2 warheads per air base. So I chose the 3 based on, for strategic reasons, what's based there. And of course, this is what was based there prior to the war. It's ever changing. They're moving resources around. So I can't speak to what's going to be based there in September. I can't even speak to what's based there right now, to be honest with you. These would be surface-to-surface air missiles. Ukraine does have the capability with the Patriot systems, among others, to intercept these missiles. So you'd have to think this would be a joint strike package with both conventional and nuclear warheads. The conventional ones kind of overwhelming the air defense systems. But we're going to go off the assumption that they are able to strike their targets. Okay. So I'm moving forward a few hours because we're going to see the next level of escalation. But first, let's check what the casualties are at this point. 21,273 casualties. Still relatively low. And again, that's not going to factor in some of the military people on base. But yeah, I think 10 kiloton warheads. They're slightly smaller than the two atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. And being detonated over military bases versus necessarily civilian centers. So what I'm going to do is, next rung in the escalation ladder, the United States is going to forward position one of its Ohio-class nuclear subs, and it's going to make a very limited strike. It's going to avoid any major cities as much as possible, and it's going to avoid any Russian nuclear locations. But Russia's escalated now to actually making nuclear strikes that are causing casualties. The United States is basically checking versus not trying to perform a checkmate, but it's basically saying, look, we're not afraid to use nuclear weapons ourselves. Now, they would have a variety of options. They could send in B-2 stealth bombers, drop gravity bombs, different choices. I just went with the sub in this case. And not the full sub-arsenal, just a very limited amount of strikes. So, and not a lot of thought, just stuff that was close by. Some time to launch to land will be very short. So it'll give time for the Russians to be able to, before, not enough time for them to react to say, oh crap, we're getting fired upon. We need to, This will basically give them a chance for the strikes to happen, have an idea, okay, it's of a limited nature, and what do they want to do as a response. And again, intentionally trying to avoid any nuclear weapon locations and or larger civilian population centers. And one thing about this scenario, and I, try to be as realistic as possible as I kind of plan this out, on the assumption it's a simulation, but that this is going off the assumption that both sides don't want this to get into an all-out nuclear strike. That'll mean the end, likely, of their governments. Who knows what else, long term. And so, what this kind of is going to show is not so much somebody going to a high extreme, more so a lot of people just trying to check and say, hey, look, we're as crazy as you are. Let's cut the crap and stop. And it still leads to getting out of hand. So I'll probably, I'm going to speed stuff up sometimes because I do a lot of manually targeting now. I know there's one of the complaints previous letting the AI, and AI does do some wonky stuff, but manually targeting takes a long time. So, I'm looking at reference sheets, looking at other stuff. Doesn't make sense. This is something weird. So, going to execute this plan. Very limited. So, we're going to 445, just give a kind of frame of reference of how long from launch to landing. I usually look at 15 minutes is kind of that sweet spot that you got to assume there's got to be a certain amount of time for detection of the launch, notifications to go out, people to be discussed, potentially woken up, any number of things. And then with enough certainty to give an order of, yeah, we need to take that level. So we're looking about 6 minutes in, 6 to 7 minutes in from maybe 8 minutes at total time. That's not going to be a lot of time for the Russian government to react to. So they're going to have at least a baseline. They wouldn't know the casualties right away, but you see right here, this 88,000. So even trying to limit the amount of casualties utilizing nuclear weapons is going to, again, represent a greater escalation path. So in this scenario, now they have struck Russian locations, Russian bases. The Russians are going to respond, and again, in a limited fashion, and it's kind of this tit for tat, and they're going to hit some U.S. bases. Now, they're going to hit U.S. bases in Germany, kind of twofold thing. Still some animosity towards the old World War II thing. But second, too, they're trying not to continue this escalation and shooting missiles all the way across the planet. Leaves a lot of time between launch and detonation for other countries to react. And so, again, they're trying to make a shorter, quicker launch. So here you see I've kind of skipped up. They actually have already launched here. So they're in flight. And you'll see targeting some U.S. bases, Ramstein Air Base, and a few others there in Germany. And again, it's kind of a like-for-like escalation at this point. Again, the hope is going to be on the Russian side this time that, hey, it's kind of like we've each got our hits in, that this is going to be kind of the end goal. You hit some of our bases, now we've hit some of yours. Let's call it even. Let's see here. So, of course, the casualties on the German side, a little bit closer to some cities, 327,000. So we're getting up there on losses. The United States, and this is an election year, can't be seen as weak. They're going to make a drastic decision at this point. They want to try to eliminate as much of the Russian nuclear stockpile as possible. And so they're going to use some of the forward position subs, including the one I used earlier, and I'm speeding things up because there's a ton of targeting. But they're going to use 2 of their subs armed with the Trident sub-launch ballistic missile, and they're going to hit their missile farms, and also some of their air bases and a few other strategic locations. They're still trying to avoid targeting cities as much as possible. Again, it's trying to eliminate the ability for the Russians to continue the escalation on nuclear strikes. This would clearly be very destabilizing, but it's at this point, though, that there's probably an assumption that it's not going to end here and that it is going to continue to escalate. So they're going to forward position these subs, and what the goal is going to be is to hit as much as they can before Russia can give that decision to, we got to strike back with whatever we have. At the same time, they'd be hunting their boomers as much as they could. Now, probably more likely they'd be near their coast where they'd be protected. I did represent some losses on both sides. So I had a Isle-class sub destroyed. I had 2 of the Russian ballistic missile subs destroyed. And also, I did some other assumptions, a certain percentage of failure rate. And even on the United States side, I mean, we just had a failure rate, or we had a failure in ICBM silo test launch. So I did about 5% of a failure rate for the United States and about 15% for Russia. Is that accurate? I don't know. It's just, again, you have to make certain assumptions for a simulation. I always stress this when people want to put a comment saying it's not realistic or whatever, and say simulations aren't predictors of what will happen. They're used to model what could happen under a certain set of circumstances. The set of circumstances is an assumption on a certain amount of failure rate, an assumption about a certain level of escalation that could happen. Again, you could just as easily run this on the flip side with the Russians escalating to this level first. And now I would say they would probably have a difficulty getting their subs near the U.S. coast to make a strike like that. And I think the United States has a better ability to do that. But having said that, you could just as easily do it, and it would give some level of advantage to Russia. Because again, when it comes to nuclear war, there's no winners, but you're better off making the strikes first. So I gave Russia, I want to say, 12 minutes from launch to them to be able to react. So at this point, they're like, okay, we know something's coming. They're targeting. It's not just a couple warheads. This is a large strike. We need to implement our version of the PSYOP plan, basically, which is hit the United States and hit the United Kingdom too, wherever there's U.S. bases or U.S. forward based. But their main goal is going to be a mix too. They're going to try and eliminate, because the United States still hasn't launched any of their ICBMs. So there's going to be a mix, and they're going to attempt to neutralize as many ICBMs as they can while also hitting some industrial and civilian targets too. Always a big question, it seems like, when people say, why would you target the enemy side's ICBMs? Well, that's under an assumption too that everyone launches everything right away. And that's not always the case. Remember, there's also, weapons that are stockpiled that aren't actually deployed, that could be deployed in the future. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why you would target it. But here's a big one. They haven't even utilized any of them yet. So the better they could, there's an opportunity Russia could to stop a large part of the U.S. nuclear triad. Now, of course, on the flip side, the U.S. is detecting that Russia's launching a massive retaliation. And so, again, they're going to launch a retaliation strike too. Still not going to utilize the entirety of their force, but 65%. They're going to want to retain some weaponry. For any future conflicts. There's still China in the mix and other places. It's crazy when you start to see it, and you start to see this is still a thing that's going to be a limited nature, because the U.S. took out a lot of the Russian silos and other sites. And the United States isn't even firing off the entirety of their force. But, just the sheer number of warheads that are going to go out. It's just insanity. I tell you, I reminisce, there was some large-scale tornadoes coming through. We live in Kentucky. And it seems like Kentucky's like the new tornado alley. It seems like we're getting tornadoes just left and right. And seeing them and watching the radar throughout the night, it's not a comparison. The destructive force of multiple nuclear warheads, hundreds of nuclear warheads, would be way greater than a tornado. But there's that certain level of helplessness you would see in the same token. You see the stuff coming, you can take as much precaution, but, when I seen devastation in 2021, early 2022, when it hit Mayfield, Kentucky, and Dawson Springs, and some of those locations just got hit again. The devastation you've seen, it's just, there's like nothing you could do. The house just completely destroyed. Even if you're in a basement, the chance your house could be caving in on you. There's any number of things. If you've seen our videos about our home gym, we have a nice walkout basement, In hindsight, I didn't realize it. If I'd known, I would have bought a house on, the other side, because our walkout basement faces the direction that storms come. So, unfortunately, there's a lot of weight and gym equipment down there. I always think, man, if a tornado hits and we're down there, I'm going to have these 45-pound plates flying around like these missiles. Not a good thought. So, I have to build my own fallout shelter just for tornadoes. Anyways, we're looking at some of the warheads dropping. They are striking these nuclear sponges known as the ICBM silos. Still a ton of warheads out there. It's mesmerizing. So, I think I'm going to speed stuff up a little bit, just because I know some people say they don't like when it's sped up, but at some point too, these, don't want to keep people for an hour just waiting while this stuff strikes. I'm actually doing this one slower than a lot of them. But I do listen to feedback. So people say they don't like when it's sped up. People didn't like using AI. And, sometimes you still use AI. The initial strikes are all manual, but then eventually did use AI on this one. Unlike my Cuban Missile Crisis one, which was all manual. And I'm talking over 1,000 warheads. There's a lot of work going to that. But check out that video, an alternate history video, what happened if the Cuban Missile Crisis went hot. All right, calculating the casualties. Let's take a look and see what we got. There's quite a bit of strikes, so it takes it a second, but all right, so we're looking at over 34 million Russian casualties, 15.7 million U.S. casualties, 1.3 million United Kingdom, a little over 1 million in German casualties. Obviously, there's going to be casualties in Ukraine. There's going to be some in some follow-on areas. 53.6 million casualties overall. So, obviously, this would be a very devastating event. Look, it only took place over a couple days. And I wanted to just show an example of an escalation path where instead of going one-upping each other, it's really trying to check each other, call each other, and instead it still escalates. So I think a really important takeaway on this video and any other when it comes to the Ukraine conflict is I think people have to take what some leaders say at face value, and I think there's a lot of assumptions I see that there's nuclear bluffing, brinkmanship, all these different things. Take it at face value. This situation could still very easily escalate to a point that the casualty rates wouldn't just be in the hundreds of thousands, but we're talking multiple millions of people dead, economic systems collapsed, worldwide famine, and numerous other things. Take what people say serious. Keep that in mind. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you'd like to see next. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.